Have you ever wondered why it feels like the harder you try to follow God, the greater the opposition becomes? What if the battle isn't really between you and your circumstances? And what if there is another conversation happening, one you can't even see? Today, let's go beneath the surface. Welcome to Skin Deep, a sacred space where we peel back the layers, speak the unspeakable, and remember who we were before the world told us who we had to be. I'm Kiara Charles, and today, we're going beneath the surface of one of the most misunderstood books in the Bible, the story of Job. For years, I've heard this story taught as a lesson about suffering. Others have taught it as a story of endurance, and some have even reduced it to a story about loss and restoration. But as I sat with this story in prayer and meditation, God shifted my perspective because beneath Job's suffering, there's another story unfolding: a courtroom, an accusation, a challenge to the authenticity of a relationship. And in the middle of it all, a God who never loses sight of his covenant. Throughout this season, we've been asking one question over and over again. What does this reveal about the nature of God? Joseph taught us that God's purpose cannot be interrupted. Esau and Jacob reminded us that God's promise cannot be stolen. And Jacob and Laban showed us that God's covenant removes the need to strive. And now Job invites us to see something else. What happens when accusation stands before the sovereignty of God? Let's see what happens in the story. The story of Job opens by introducing us to a man who is described as blameless and upright. He feared God. He turned away from evil. He was wealthy. He was respected. He had a large family, influence, and honor within his community. But what fascinates me about this story is that before anything happens on earth, something is already happening in heaven. The scene shifts into what many refer to as the heavenly court. The sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and among them comes the accuser. The one whose role is to accuse, the one who continuously questions, the one who looks for fault. The accuser says something that changes the entire direction of the story. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, of course he follows you. Look at everything you've given him. Take away the blessings, and he'll curse you to your face. Notice what is being questioned. Not Job's wealth, not his family, not even his behavior. The authenticity of his relationship with God. Then something remarkable happens. God permits the test, but he also establishes boundaries. The accuser cannot simply do whatever he wants. There are limits. First, he may touch everything that Job has, but not Job himself. Later, he is permitted to touch Job's body, but not take his life. Even before the suffering begins, God reveals something about his nature. He remains sovereign. Then everything begins collapsing. Job's livestock are stolen, the servants are killed, his children die. The life he had built seems to unravel in the matter of moments. And then his own body begins to fail him. Painful sores cover him from head to toe. He sits among ashes, scraping his skin with broken pottery. Even his wife, looking at the depth of his suffering, says, "Curse God and die." Not long afterward, 3 of Job's closest friends arrive. At first, they simply sit with him in silence for 7 days. And honestly, that may have been the wisest thing they ever did. Because the moment they began speaking, they began searching for reasons. You must have done something. There has to be a hidden sin. God wouldn't allow this unless you deserved it. They spend chapter after chapter trying to fit Job's suffering into a formula, but Job refuses to accept their explanation. He doesn't claim to understand everything. He doesn't pretend he isn't hurting. He grieves, he questions, he laments. He cries out to God with complete honesty because something deep inside of him knows this explanation does not fit the God that I have come to know. Finally, God answers, but not in the way that anyone expects. God doesn't explain every detail of Job's suffering. He doesn't tell Job about the heavenly courtroom. He doesn't even tell him about the accuser. Instead, God begins revealing himself. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you commanded the morning? Can you number the clouds? Question after question, not to humiliate Job, but to expand his perspective, to remind him that there are realities beyond what human eyes can see. By the end of the story, Job prays for the very friends who misunderstood him. His relationships are restored, his fortunes are restored twofold, and he lives a long life afterward. Most people read the ending and focus on what Job received, but I sat with this story. I realized the greatest restoration wasn't what Job got back. It was the understanding he gained about the God who had been with him, even when he couldn't see the whole picture. As I continue to sit with this story, God began reminding me of myself. At first, I saw myself in Job. There was a season in my life, one of the greatest seasons of testing I've ever experienced, where it felt like accusation was coming from every direction. It was almost as if the question being asked in heaven had become the question the people were asking about me on earth. She only loves God because he blesses her. She only follows God because he's favored her. She only has faith because life has been good to her. Then God took me back to another season. He reminded me that I've also been Job's wife. I've looked at my life and I've said, God, if this is the life that you promised to protect, why should I continue following you? I've questioned him. I've become frustrated. I've wanted to walk in the opposite direction because my pain felt louder than his promises. Then he reminded me of another version of myself, the friends. I remember looking inward and asking, what did I do wrong? I must have sinned. I must have missed God somewhere. There has to be a reason to all of this and why it's happening. I searched for formulas because formulas felt safer than mystery. If I could find the mistake, maybe I could fix the suffering, but that wasn't God's heart either. And then God brought me back to Job, the version of me that refused to pretend, the version of me that cried, questioned, lamented, the version of me that was honest enough to say, God, I don't understand. What I love about Job is that he never confuses honesty with unbelief. He never pretends he isn't hurting, and he brings his whole heart before God. And as I reflected on that, I realized something. Healing isn't about deciding which character you are in the story. It's about recognizing that at different seasons of our lives, we've been all of them. We've all had moments where we've spoken from despair. We've all had moments where we searched for someone to blame. We've all had moments where we've questioned God. We've all had moments where we stood faithfully when no one else understood what we were carrying. Then something shifted. God explained my perspective. I forgave myself. I forgave my accusers. I forgave the people who misunderstood me. Not because what happened didn't hurt, but because I finally understood something I couldn't see. While I was living through it all, the test was never punishment. It was perspective. It wasn't designed to destroy my faith. It revealed my faith. It wasn't designed to prove something to God. God already knew me. It revealed what was living on the inside of me. The test wasn't only revealing me. It was exposing every voice surrounding me. It revealed despair. It revealed certainty. It revealed accusation. It revealed integrity. It revealed who was speaking from fear and who was speaking from relationship. And that's when I understood why the battle belongs to the Lord. Because while I was trying to survive the testing on earth, God was already handling the courtroom in heaven. I never had to defend myself before the one who already knew my heart. My responsibility wasn't to answer every accusation. My responsibility was to remain in covenant with the God who had already spoken over my life. And maybe that's one of the greatest freedoms we can experience. Realizing that not every accusation requires our defense. Sometimes faithfulness is the only response God is asking from us. So, what does this reveal about God's nature? I think this story reveals something that many of us spend our entire lives trying to understand. God values integrity more than comfort. Think about it. When the accuser enters the story, he doesn't question Job's wealth. He doesn't question Job's family. He doesn't question Job's influence. He questions the authenticity of Job's relationship with God. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, take away everything you've given him and let's see if he still loves you. But God already knew. God wasn't trying to gather information. God wasn't trying to discover whether Job loved him. God already knew Job's heart. And that tells me something so beautiful. God knows who we are before life begins stripping everything we thought identified us. He knows who we are before the accusation, before the suffering, before the blessing, before the restoration. God's knowledge of us isn't determined by our circumstances. It's rooted in relationship. I noticed something else also. God places boundaries around the test. The accuser cannot move beyond what God permits. First, he cannot touch Job himself. Then, he cannot take Job's life. Those boundaries matter because they reveal that even in suffering, God never surrendered his sovereignty. The test had limits. The accusation had limits. The suffering had limits, but God's covenant did not. Then finally, God speaks, not to explain every detail, but to reveal his perspective. He reminds Job that there are realities beyond human understanding, not to shame him, but to invite him into trust. Sometimes God doesn't answer every why. Sometimes God reveals more of who he is. And when we truly begin to see who God is, our questions begin to change. Now let's look beneath the surface of ourselves, because every character in this story represents a voice we all carry at different times. The friends represent certainty. If something bad happened, someone must have deserved it. That way of thinking gives us the illusion that life is predictable. Because if suffering only happens to people who deserve it, then maybe we can avoid suffering by doing everything right. But life isn't that simple. Job's wife becomes the voice of despair. If this is what faith gets you, why continue? I think every honest believer has heard that voice at some point. Maybe not out loud, but somewhere deep inside. Now Job becomes the voice of honesty. He doesn't pretend. He doesn't suppress his emotions. He cries. He laments. He questions. And God never condemns him for bringing his honest heart. Then there's the accuser. Psychologically, I don't just see a character, I see a pattern. The accuser represents a voice that continuously questions what God has already declared. You aren't really loved. You don't really belong. Your faith isn't genuine. You only follow God when life is good. It's the same pattern we saw in the garden. Did God really say? It's the same pattern we see with Jesus. If you are the Son of God, the same pattern, we see it here with Job. Does Job fear God for nothing? Notice something. The accusation rarely begins with behavior. It begins with identity. It begins with relationship. It begins with trying to make us question what God has already spoken. So what does this look like today? I think many of us spend years living inside of courtrooms that God never asked us to enter. Trying to defend ourselves, trying to explain ourselves, trying to prove ourselves, trying to answer every accusation, trying to convince people that we're good enough, that we're honest enough, that we're worthy enough, that we're lovable enough. And while we're exhausting ourselves, defending our character, God is inviting us to do something entirely different. Remain faithful, because Job never won by arguing. He never won by proving himself. He never won by defeating the accuser. He remained. And that's where this story became deeply personal for me. As I sat with Job, God reminded me that I've been every character in this story. I've been Job, questioning, crying, trying to make sense of pain. I've been Job's wife, wondering if following God was worth it when life didn't make sense. And I've been the friends, looking for reasons, trying to explain suffering with simple answers. Because I realized healing isn't choosing which character you are. Healing is recognizing you've been all of them, then allowing God to transform every one of those voices until his voice becomes the loudest. Because the battle was never about whether God knew Job. He already knew. The battle was about whether the accusation could overturn what God already knew to be true. And it couldn't. The accusation failed, not because Job was perfect, but because God's knowledge of Job was greater than the accusation against him. That changes everything. Because maybe the greatest freedom isn't found in proving ourselves to people. Maybe it's found in resting in the truth that the one who knows us completely has already spoken. Amen. So let me leave you with this question. What courtroom have you been living in? Whose accusations have you been trying to answer? And where have you been exhausting yourself trying to defend what God has already declared? What would you change if you truly believed that the battle belonged to the Lord? Not as a cliche, but as a way of living. What if every accusation didn't require your response? What if your greatest testimony was remaining in covenant? Because maybe the greatest victory wasn't that Job got everything back. Maybe the greatest victory was that the accusation could not stand. Truth remained truth, and relationship remained genuine. God remained faithful, and the courtroom belonged to God all along. So let's continue to remember. Healing isn't about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before survival taught you to hide. So if this episode spoke to you, don't just watch it, sit with it. Journal through it, pray through it. Hi, baby. Reflect on what God is revealing underneath the surface. And if you're ready to go deeper, I've included additional reflection questions below, along with a link to the healing journal. And if you're looking for one-on-one spiritual guidance, you can book an alignment session with me at kiaracharles.com. And if this message resonated with you, make sure you like, subscribe, and share it with someone in the middle of their own healing journey. And if you feel led to support this ministry and the work that's being built through this space, you can sow into the vision through Cash App, Skin Deep Podcasts, because every conversation, every episode, and every story shared here is creating a space where people can heal out loud together. And remember, what's buried doesn't disappear. It just waits to be witnessed. Until next time, stay rooted, stay focused, and stay skin deep.